We'll try to make sure we start on time so that because some people become impatient when you wait for long.
Yeah, sounds good.
Good morning, colleagues. Good afternoon for those who are in the afternoon. I hope you are all keeping well, and thanks for joining this very important webinar. My name is George Wamukoya. I work with AGNES, and I'm going to moderate this session. Just confirming whether, Laura, we have enough, we have everyone that we think should be on board.
Hi, George. We have 26 attendees online already, so I think that's enough. We can get started.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Yeah, colleagues, this is we really value your time. This is a webinar that is part of the CADAP support program, that is a joint program between the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, and the GIZ, and the SV NAREN. And we do have other supporting institutions, particularly CCAFS and GIZ, and of course, AGNES. The purpose of this meeting is primarily to share with you the outcome of the survey that some of you did participate on the capacity needs assessment in respect to implementing the NDCs in the agriculture sector. As you all agree, agriculture is the backbone of the many economies in Africa, and more importantly for the livelihoods. Bear in mind that the majority of farmers are smallholder farmers, and therefore the need for them to be empowered to be able to earn a living, but at the same time build resilience while contributing to emission reduction. And therefore, the way we have structured, we're going to have a welcome overview by a presentation by Dr. Manyewu Mutamba from the AUDA-NEPAD, primarily to share with us the general frame of NDC implementation in Africa from the perspective of the Africa Union. And then our colleague Laura Cramer from CCAFS, Elri, and Alberto Millan from the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT to share with us the feedback that we received from participants in the survey. And we plan to have adequate time to be able to receive feedback through your personal intervention so that we are able to get as much information as possible, because this is a process that we would like to get your input in. So before I open the floor to Dr. Manyewu, Laura could just share with us some of the guiding processes that you may need to be aware of should you want to either pose a question or interact with the process. Laura, you have the floor.
Thank you, George. Yes, as George mentioned, we have budgeted plenty of time for feedback and discussion after the short presentations. And so if you want to contribute, there's a way you can raise your hand through the Zoom platform here. So look on your control panel and look for a way to raise your hand. And as you do that, we will see it on our side. And then as George calls on each person, I will unmute you and allow you to speak. The Q&A function is also available if you want to post questions or comments instead of saying them out loud. You can type in as well. And when you're unmuted to speak, please start out by saying your name and country so that we know who is talking. And then the questions down here are the ones that we'll be asking you to respond to after the presentation. So I'll come back to this. after we have Manyewu's presentation. So now I will stop sharing my screen and we'll have Manyewu's presentation. So I'll turn it back over to George.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So as I did indicate, I now invite Dr. Manyewu to make his presentation.
Thank you, George. Thank you for the opportunity, and welcome to all the colleagues that are joining us. I will set the scene, so to speak, or just give a background in terms of you know, the work that we're doing on NDCs is AUDA. I'm sure many of you already understand the process behind the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs that we are speaking about today. But what I'm going to do essentially is to present, you know, the logic or the rationale from our side as AUDA in terms of why we felt we wanted to get involved in this work and why we felt there is additional work that needs to be done on strengthening NDCs, which are a key part of the global sort of response mechanism to climate change. So I will share the screen just to share my presentation. It's just a few slides that I've put together just to summarize some of the key sort of points that I want to make with respect to our role within, you know, this endeavor to try and strengthen NDCs. Okay, so I hope everyone can see my my screen. Essentially, I want to just summarize the background. I want to summarize how we got involved, but I also want to highlight some of the key gaps that we feel our contribution is actually going to contribute to, and some of the details will actually come from the colleagues that are going to present later in terms of some of the areas of work that we feel need, you know, attention on NDCs as we go forward. And perhaps the background is that I'm sure many of you will know that NDCs were essentially national commitments that were submitted to the global climate negotiations at the time of the Paris Agreement. Essentially, these were commitments, these were ambitions that each of the countries was requested to submit in terms of their contribution to mitigation, but also in terms of you know, the adaptation actions that they are going to also undertake nationally to address the challenges that climate change pose to each of the countries. And Africa equally also submitted their NDCs. And the interesting angle for Africa is, for us, essentially, is the prominence of agriculture in the NDCs that were submitted by African countries. So that's why we felt, you know, our work could really focus on, you know, the strengthening NDCs, particularly given the key role of agriculture in addressing challenges related to climate change on the continent. And as you know, the agricultural sector is a key area of focus, you know, for African member states, you know, in line with their commitments they've already, you know, made. For example, the Malabo Declaration of 2014, which was very clear on the need to enhance resilience of livelihoods and production systems to climate, you know, variability. And you would also perhaps know that the NEPAD program on agriculture and climate change was approved at the same convention, and the vision of targeting 25 million farm households by 2025 was born also at that summit. So for us, this is a key part of our work as AUDA, as the implementing agents of the African Union. So it's central to the work that we do. And many of these ambitions, many of these targets and outcomes are also emphasized in the Agenda 2063. Essentially, that is the blueprint for Africa's development for the next 50 years. So this is key to the work that we do, and it aligns very much with ambitions and commitments that Africa has already made for in terms of addressing the challenge of climate change, especially in the agriculture sector. As you can see from my slide, NDCs, agriculture is a prominent part of what countries have proposed as part of their nationally determined contributions, to the global climate agreement. So which means for us, it's an important part of what nations on the African continent want to deliver, both in terms of mitigation aspirations, contributing to mitigation efforts, but also in terms of nationally, relevant adaptation strategies that are key to, strengthening resilience particularly for farmers and other key players, in the agricultural sector nationally. As you can see there, most of the countries on the continent have agriculture as a central piece within the NDCs. So for us, naturally, this is an area that we really want to strengthen. We really want, while we are delighted that agriculture is really getting this focus, but we also feel this is an opportunity to make a significant contribution and get it right in terms of, contributing to the challenges that are brought by climate change. So this informs why we, felt we needed to play a significant part in shaping NDCs, which in our view are also an expression of, although they are commitments that are done at the global level, these are expressions of national priorities and aspirations that our member states have expressed, and our role is really to support them in delivering those aspirations and also in meeting their global commitments that they've made as part of the Paris Agreement that they've signed. So as many of you would remember, the NDCs were essentially crafted at a time, when parties to the Paris Agreement were still in negotiations. So they were essentially part of the environment, that was, the dynamics that are part of the negotiations within the climate change global discussions. So there was a lot that was happening, and some of the key attributes of what happened during that time are reflected in the outcomes of the NDCs themselves, because the politics, the dynamics that are typical of climate change negotiations, also ended up influencing, both the process, but also the substance of the NDCs themselves. And typically, because the time was very limited, it was the consultations and the process to prepare the NDCs was very short, and the consultations were very limited, and some of the stakeholders that are key to at the national level to processes of addressing climate change were not as actively engaged as would have been necessary at that time. But also when you look at some of the analysis that has gone into looking at the the NDCs that came out of this process, it is clear that there are still gaps and weaknesses that in many ways are now also even hindering the effective implementation of these commitments and ambitions. And I must also add that some of these weaknesses and gaps are also found in other national planning processes and program designs that are, in my view, a big part of why we have not seen as much progress as we would have wanted to see in the implementation of key processes like climate smart agriculture on the African countries. And for us, this is a key part, this is a key time within that process, because 2020 represents a time when parties to the Paris Agreement are reviewing and revising their NDCs. And this to us is an opportunity to really use that opportunity to strengthen the NDCs, interact with the member states, interact with other key stakeholders that are part of this process, to strengthen NDCs in a way that will also, strengthen the ability of our member states to implement some of these commitments and priorities. So for us, this is a major opportunity, and that's why we're partnering with our partners, GIZ. We're partnering with knowledge partners like CCAFS, who are a key part of our analytical ability and our ability to also influence and sharpen and deepen the understanding of some of the options that are on the table. So this essentially, brings, to the fore some of our observations and some of the, the areas of focus in terms of how we can support the NDC process. So here I will just highlight 2 or 3 areas that we are really focusing on in terms of strengthening NDCs, informed by, analysis that has been done by ourselves, by other partners, which have really helped us to identify areas that we believe require support, if, the second generation of NDCs are going to actually be, better sort of in terms of the content, and also in terms of their, the implementation that comes out of it. So the first area, of work really for us is, the area around climate smart agriculture itself as the dominant approach that you find in the agricultural sector that has been embraced by member states, across the continent. For us, it is very clear that CSA is the dominant approach. But we still feel that there are key important details that are still lacking, particularly in terms of how to deliver, programs on CSA. We see that there's still a lot of, value addition that is required to go beyond, some of the regional or some of the earlier generation of national adaptation plans and strategies. So we feel that there's work that is required to go beyond just understanding these are the CSA practices that can work in this country under these circumstances. I think we need to go beyond that. And I think the major question now is how do you actually roll out these programs in a way, that is sustainable, in a way that happens at scale, and also in a way that, you actually see significant impacts, both from a climate perspective, but also from a socioeconomic, perspective. So these are areas that we really feel NDCs can strengthen, and the training materials that we're producing are focusing on this and looking at how do you create incentives and capacity for farmers to actually adopt some of the technologies and practices that we are driving, and essentially how do you build innovation models and interventions that are sustainable and that can happen at scale, to see the kind of impact that we are looking for, and also to push these things to happen at a pace that is consistent with the agencies that that is required when you look at the challenge of climate change. The second area that we are focusing on relates to improving clarity on financing of NDCs. And this also links to and informs financing models for other processes at the national level, all the way up to even the program level, in our view. As many of you would know, at the time when NDCs were being presented, many of the financing arrangements around NDCs were actually put as conditional. In fact, the implementation of NDCs was actually put as conditional to accessing international climate finance. And I guess given the time, there was very little thought process and I guess engagements in terms of innovation around how, you know, the aspirations, the priorities that had been expressed in NDCs, particularly in climate smart agriculture, how this could be financed. And perhaps that was also part of the politics of negotiations at the time. And, you know, there's a lot of, you know, back and forth around that, and a lot of, you know, gamesmanship that happens within the negotiations on the financing aspect of climate change. So that influenced, you know, what you see in the current generation of NDCs. So our hope is that as the NDCs are reviewed and refined and revised, we are going to see a much more thorough process of looking at how this could actually be financed going forward. And I think from the work that we're doing now, it is very clear that financing, you know, climate action, particularly climate smart agriculture, we need a multi-pronged approach. You know, international climate finance, you know, by itself is never going to be enough. The need is so huge that not any one of these financing mechanisms is going to be enough. In fact, now it even shows that other elements, like for example, the private sector is key. If we can harness, you know, the private sector, you know, as part of the financing mechanism, we can do much more. But also even our national budget itself, you know, there's an opportunity for this to be leveraged, you know, to finance climate action, you know. But the overall message essentially is that a combination or a blending of all of these options will have to be at the center of how we finance climate smart agriculture going forward. So the training materials that we're producing around this topic, they cover a whole lot of, you know, these aspects, and they really, you know, go, you know, into some depth in, you know, analyzing and providing options and, you know, and potential models of how, you know, these financing mechanisms can be unleashed to support financing of climate and smart agriculture. So the third area is
around the private sector. This growing realization within the, you know, the climate change, climate smart agriculture discussions that, you know, the private sector are a key part of how you drive this process. You know, you see that in most of the NDCs, this has been mentioned, but there's lack of depth and detail in terms of how do you actually do that, you know, and position, you know, a private sector led adaptation and mitigation action is a key part of the overall sort of national, you know, response to climate change. So in our view, this is missing a key opportunity to leverage the financial, the technical, the business, and the human resources that reside within this this sector. And you know, the better we are at leveraging, you know, these resources from the private sector, the more successful we are likely to be as Africa in terms of our response to climate change. So in most of the NDCs, there's mention, but there's lack of detail. You also see that even in some of the programs and designs of climate smart agriculture interventions, there's still lack of the instruments, the strategies in terms of how do you actually create that environment, those incentives that the private players actually require to come on board. You know, and generally, you know, an approach or a mindset that is built on a business approach to climate action. You know, so those are some of the, you know, the competencies, the skills, and the inputs that some of the training materials we're producing are contributing to, and hopefully, you know, should inform the you know, the next generation of NDCs, and also even the programs that are being crafted at national level in terms of climate smart agriculture. The last sort of area that I would like to just discuss briefly is the area of measurement, reporting, and verification. This for many of us is a very new area. It's a key sort of requirement in given the global nature of NDCs, because of the requirement for transparency and consistency in terms of how do we actually measure. If we're saying this is our contribution to mitigation, how do we actually measure and report on it, and the processes that are required for verification to actually make sure that what is reported is actually what is happening. So this is a new area. This is a very technical area and quite complex, and the skills, the competencies are still in their sort of formative stages for most of our experts on the continent. So there's a lot of work that is required to understand clearly the technicalities around this area and how to actually apply it in designing say climate smart agriculture programs and national plans, and how to ensure these meet the standards and the requirements and the expectations that you find. For example, if you are applying for resources to the Green Climate Fund, for example, or other international mechanisms that are now requiring that you have, the MRV sort of instruments clearly outlined in terms of, how you design this program. So we have a focus on this in the training product that we are producing as a contribution to deepening the understanding of what this entails, and also, in some ways to also starting to build a cadre of technicians who are capable of supporting member states programs and other initiatives that are focusing on climate smart agriculture on the continent. So these are some of the areas that we are really trying to strengthen, and hopefully our contribution will strengthen the quality of NDCs that are coming or that are being revised, not only as part of our contribution to the global sort of requirements, that our member states are part of, but also as a contribution to strengthening their own capacity at a national level to deliver their own priorities and to respond to the challenge of climate change in the agriculture sector. So let me stop here, and hopefully, if there are questions, I can take those later. But Chair, I think I'll stop here and allow you to continue with the other presenters.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Manyewu. Very, very important presentation, because one, you have at least demonstrated the link between the continental instruments, for example, the Agenda 2063, the CADAP framework, and how they fit into the NDCs. I think that's a very, very important point, so that it's not seen like they are parallel things. And more importantly is what will be the elements that could fit into the NDC, which are clear actions that you are able to track and measure. The second area, which I think is important, is the whole question of means of implementation. How do our countries access those means of implementation in order to support the implementation of the NDCs and more so the rest of the CADAP framework interventions. And the third is a very important area in terms of private sector, because all of you who have had an interaction with GCF, which is supposed to be the main funding instrument under the Paris Agreement, you realize that it has a window on private sector. And the question we should be asking ourselves is, how is the African private sector well prepared to engage and mobilize resources, access those resources to support the interventions in Africa, but also mobilize resources from within the private sector. And finally, I think the emphasis on the issue of knowing that you're making progress. I think this is important because one of the questions that the key debate right now is, how do you know that the adaptation actions that you are taking are actually making a change beyond the project input-output? So you're looking at the impact, what will that be? And I think this is an area that we know it's problematic. We don't have agreed M&E, because much of it is either project-oriented programs, but there are some efforts that are being made to make sure that we have those tools available. And I think this is important because at this stage, when countries are revising or updating the NDCs, they will need to look at what will be the indicators to help them to track progress. And I think that is very useful input. So in order to go into in-depth of these issues, now I would request Laura to share the outcome of what many of the participants who responded to the survey say about the three broad areas that Dr. Manyewu has talked about. One, understanding the whole framework of climate change regime, international feeding into national. And then the second is understanding in how do you enhance scaling up implementation of climate action in agriculture sector in that respect, so that it buttresses what Dr. Manyewu has said. So Laura, you have the floor.
Thank you, George. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I just want to also provide a little bit more background on how this survey and this webinar came about. As Manyewu was mentioning, AUDA has been working with CCAFS and GIZ on helping to build capacity for NDC implementation in agriculture. Back in 2018, we did 2 trainings, one in East Africa and one in West Africa, and brought together some people from the national level from several countries to do training for several days. And then this year in 2020, GIZ wanted to support a 3rd training in Southern Africa. But unfortunately, the COVID situation happened before we could do that, which I think, you know, it was a shame, but it also gave us the chance to pause and to reconsider how these trainings are being done, what's being covered, and whether we can improve on the approach going forward. And so part of that was this survey that George has mentioned. And so we sent out a questionnaire to about 150 people through our networks. And the purpose of it was to get information from across the continent that can help us identify what are the capacity needs related to the implementation of NDCs. We thought we had a pretty good idea, but we, you know, can always learn more, and it's not good to assume that we know. So that was one of the main purposes of the survey. And we want to now use this webinar and your reactions to the findings to help validate those findings. So I hope you will please share with us your thoughts as we get into the final session. And then we want to use these findings to help inform the recommendations for how to alter or improve the approach in the future as we look toward other capacity building efforts moving forward. So as I said, we shared the link with about 150 people. We had a total of 49 respondents that represented 22 countries in all 5 subregions of Africa. We asked people for their level of education. People who responded were very highly educated, most having a doctoral degree, master's, and a few with a bachelor's degree. And then we had a fairly good split of men and women. Of course, the men were more, but we had 20 women respond, which I thought was pretty good. And then by age category, they skewed older, but I think the people who are earlier in their career, who are younger, probably aren't on our email list yet, so we weren't reaching them as broadly. So as Manyewu was talking about, and as George mentioned, one of the aspects that we wanted to learn about was how we can support the mainstreaming of climate change into these national planning and budgeting processes. So as an open-ended question, we asked people, what are the barriers to these processes, to mainstreaming? And people named many different barriers, and we categorized those and kind of clumped them into main categories. So a big majority of people, 68%, said that there's inadequate data to inform the climate change integration. So there just isn't the information out there that can help feed into these mainstreaming processes. There's also not enough money to support the mainstreaming processes. This was mentioned by 61% of people. We all know that, getting stakeholders together, bringing together ministries, bringing together researchers and everybody to inform these processes takes money. And so that those insufficient resources are hampering the process. There's also limited technical knowledge that people cited as a reason. 59% of the respondents indicated this. And so that is also inhibiting the mainstreaming of climate change into the national planning processes. And then a quarter of respondents said there's limited stakeholder engagement and coordination. And this is at both the national level, in between sectors and ministries, and also from the national level down to the subnational level. So those are what's holding us back there. Then we also asked people about the scaling up of climate actions. The previous trainings we did, we focused a lot on climate smart agriculture, but we also wanted to find out, are other approaches being used? And so we asked people to rate a series of statements from 1 to 5, whether they strongly disagree or strongly agree. And so first we asked them just whether they're knowledgeable about CSA and familiar with other approaches. And most respondents said that they are knowledgeable about those approaches. And so I think that, it helps us look back at our previous training materials and say, maybe we don't need to be quite at such a basic level, because most of the people who we would be inviting for such a training probably are already aware, so we can adjust our training materials using this information. But fewer respondents said that they were aware of tools for ex-ante analysis of those CSA options. And so one of the ways that we're updating the training materials is building in more information on some of those available tools and how to use them. 20% of respondents said they're not aware of knowledge sharing platforms in their country for agriculture and climate change. And so it's not an indication that those platforms don't exist, but just that the respondents are not aware of them. And so maybe that's something else to look at in terms of how to broaden those platforms and make more people aware of them. And then we also asked respondents whether they agreed with the importance of examining equity implications in climate change responses. And they almost all agreed that that is important, and that includes gender and other social inclusion aspects as well. And then we also wanted to look at, are people interested in exploring the implications of climate change beyond just agriculture, to look at broader food systems? And so most people did say that climate change is affecting broader food systems. And also most agree that there are mitigation actions that can be taken to reduce emissions from agriculture and food systems in their countries. Looking at MRV in agriculture, as Manyewu had indicated, this is something that is new to a lot of us, but some countries are making progress. And we wanted to assess where those processes are. but only half of the people who responded were familiar with their country's MRV system for agriculture. And I should say most of the respondents, well, the respondents were mixed between people who work for government, people who work for NGOs, and research organizations. So it was a mix of people. So we couldn't expect everybody to always be familiar with their country's MRV, but this can give us kind of an indication of where people are, where countries are. And so when we asked whether their country had established an MRV system for agriculture, the responses were mixed. 9 people skipped the question. About a third of people said that their country does have a functioning MRV system for agriculture, although some of those might be people from the same country. So it's not a third of countries, it's a third of respondents. And we did get some respondents, several from a certain country. So it's not completely indicating the number of countries. But a third of people said that their country does have an MRV system, and then others reported that the MRV system is in the process of being established. Adaptation M&E is another issue in itself. As George was just saying, this is something that's new. It's usually done at the project level, but now we need to be doing it at the national level, but that's not very easy. So 9 of the people who responded said they're not even aware if their country has an M&E system for adaptation. 5 people did say their country has a functioning system, and so that's good news, and we can maybe find which countries those are and learn from them, and help other countries learn from them. And then the other results, their countries are either early in the process or they're finalizing. 4 people said their country hasn't started the process yet. So that these results help give us an indication of where we need to focus our training materials, and then also even just the approach of how do we try to build capacity for these topics. And then we asked people about the main capacity needs to support scaling up of climate smart agriculture. And this goes along with, matches up very well with the needs mentioned for mainstreaming climate change into planning and budgeting, where access to financial resources, increasing the amount of data and research available, and improving the training and technical capacities all came out really strongly as the top capacity needs. So the way that we're going to use these results, as I had mentioned, is that we're going to update the existing training materials, and we will provide those to AUDA for them to use in their future capacity building exercises and efforts. And I'm putting out a call. If you have good case studies, if you're from one of those countries that has a functioning adaptation M&E system, if you have good case studies of a functioning MRV system or climate finance tracking, as Alberto will talk about just now, please get in touch with me. My email is here on the screen, l.cramer@cgiar.org. And if you have those case study examples, I'd love to include them in the training materials. So that's just a call for inputs. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I'll pass it back over to George. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Very important issues there that have been raised right from the mainstreaming of NDC climate change into planning and budgeting. And of course, the agriculture component of the NDCs is critical, and the challenges thereof. And the whole question of CSA and food systems, what actions need to be undertaken, and how do you measure them? I think that those are issues, again, that reinforce what Dr. Manyewu said. And of course, based on the responses, we may have some good case studies that could be packaged and used for training. And I think that will be very useful so that we enhance peer-to-peer learning in this respect. So with that, then I want to move to invite Alberto Millan, who's a sustainable finance expert, just to share with us the aspects relating to finance. Alberto, you have the floor.
Many thanks, George. Thank you very much, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be presenting the findings that came out of the survey with regards to climate finance and then private sector engagement for NDC implementation. Okay, so the objectives of the survey was basically to identify what was the key capacity and the capacity needs related to the implementation of NDCs for agriculture, and then have a focus specifically on climate finance and private sector engagement. And we would love to receive feedback from participants in this webinar to better understand if these findings resonate with the current needs in countries and if they differ, and how we could actually strengthen the findings on the survey. So the first thing that we look at was the understanding about the landscape of climate finance, the sources and the different modalities. What we observed was that there is a basic understanding of climate finance, but that the knowledge of the current finance landscape and the potential sources that are available is more limited. So most of the respondents were focusing on climate funds, specifically on the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund, and then on multilateral banks like World Bank and African Development Bank. And then few of them were actually mentioning bilateral agencies, but that was the bulk of the respondents. Few of them were actually aware of what are the most prominent sources of climate finance. So when we look at the landscape as we know it specifically from 2016, which is not the most up-to-date globally, but the most updated for the land use sector specifically. When it comes to the breakdown, we see that the majority of those sources actually come from governments and development finance institutions. So with regards to those domestic sources of climate finance, most of the people were pointing at government budgets, but very few of them were actually citing or making reference to domestic development finance institutions as key players. The majority believes that the level of climate finance in their countries is either extremely inadequate or inadequate, with very few respondents believing that it was moderate, the volume of climate finance. Then we look at the enabling environment to mainstream and track climate finance. So not only the ability to bring climate finance in country, but then in those countries where there is already climate finance at domestic level, how to track it, including the inflows. So more than half of respondents believe that the country has not established an efficient system to track climate finance flows, and that there is insufficient understanding of how best to track such flows within the country. Almost half of the respondents are aware of how domestic finance and budgeting is allocated for climate purposes, whereas the other half believes that climate is not specifically earmarked yet, and that there are efforts that may relate to climate purposes, but that are not accounted as such, or that the current system that is in place is insufficient. There are different examples across countries, but there is, in that sense, common understanding that efforts are in place, but that may not be the most conducive for the purpose. Then with regards to private sector interest and potential to support climate action, this was quite interesting because there was a real mix of responses. So it seems that there is limited knowledge on the role that domestic and international private sector can play and the existing opportunities. As I mentioned before, there is a lot of focus on the GCF, but much less so on attracting domestic and international private capital. and the role that the combination of both can actually play. For many respondents, it's unclear how to engage private sector in the process and what enabling environment and frameworks are needed to do so. They are aware that it's not happening, but unclear on how this could be done or how other countries are actually doing so. So some of them believe that the private sector shall support public sector generating public goods. Other ones are basically more inclined to think that the private sector should be supporting technological development and then rollout of new technologies and support to value chains. Most of those respondents stated that SMEs are unaware of climate finance, that they are engaged in agribusinesses, but not in climate-related matters. And the main reason for that is that they lack the technical and financial capacity to engage in climate finance. At the same time, there's a large proportion of respondents that are unclear how, if possible at all, SMEs could actually access climate finance. And with regards to the capacities needed in general to access climate finance, there is consensus, general consensus that there is need to increase the institutional and technical capacities on climate finance. It seems that while many countries or most of the countries have a solid expertise on the intersection between agriculture and development, the link between climate change and agriculture and development is not as strong. And most of the respondents, an overwhelming majority of respondents, claim that the main issue is at institutional level, no? and the technical capacities. They believe that additional support is needed to strengthen or develop, in some of the cases, policy, legal, and regulatory frameworks that are conducive to attract investments. This goes both ways for public and private sector, but there seems to be common understanding that particularly so for the private sector. Countries, they believe that countries would greatly benefit from additional support to develop MRVs and M&E tools. On the MRV statement is mostly what was expressed or stated was regarding the ability to track international and domestic climate finance flows. And something that everyone seems to really agree is the need to increase the capacity to identify and prepare solid proposals. So an overwhelming majority believes that one of the key challenges to identify or to identify and access climate finance sources is because then they have problems to identify potential environmental, social, but also financially attractive projects. And then the difficulties to actually structure and develop that type of project and the subsequent implementation. And then the challenge is to navigate the bureaucratic process, not to access climate finance. One of the key issues that has been mentioned in different parts of the survey is that accessing specifically the Green Climate Fund is incredibly complex, and that they need support to be able to navigate the process in a cost-effective manner, no? and more successful manner. And then last one is that there's a critical need to strengthen collaboration among different stakeholders. There is common agreement that cross-sectoral coordination within country is incredibly complex and that not always takes place as much as they would expect. Barely any mention to cross-collaboration across countries. And then the collaboration with SMEs seems to be absent based on the respondents, given the lack of capacity of SMEs to be able to engage with climate finance and then to access it. And then also the need to collaborate to understand what other peers are doing and explore synergies. No? There are successful examples that we've seen based on what Laura just mentioned, of South-South collaboration of countries that have collaborated. But when exploring that through the survey, most of the reference to collaboration was within country rather than across countries. And I don't know if, George, you want to take it from here, or shall we look also at the different needs that we would like to see how respondents, how participants believe?
Okay, so thanks, Alberto. Very, very useful. Actually, this is one of the highest priority area for Africa. I've had the opportunity to work with AUDA and the CSA, the program on the climate financing in 12 countries, and I can tell you there are a lot of challenges which the African countries are going through to access resources and even just to engage with accredited entities or otherwise, and more difficult with the private sector. And therefore this is an area that is very, very critical that we need to look at. I think what we'll do is I know yes, Laura has put on the screen the way we want to proceed now, because at least you've heard from our three experts, Dr. Manyewu, from the continental perspective of how they see NDC fitting into the commitments, continental commitments, CADEP process, national NIPs and implementation frameworks, and more importantly, the Malabo declaration, where there's now a framework for countries to report progress. And I know that I hope Professor Ayan is online. They have at least developed some tools on how to track resilience. It's not perfect, but at least some efforts have been made. So, and then Laura was sharing with us what respondents were talking about in relation to country processes, and the whole question of the approaches in climate action and the barriers thereof, and of course the climate finance challenge. Now it's your time to share with us very briefly. Just try to be as brief as possible so that we can have as many colleagues participating as possible. So what you need to do is one is, if you want to contribute, you can raise your hand, and I think if you look at your screen, you should be able to see where you can raise your hand, and then we'll be able to see, and we'll give you the chance. The other way you could do it is also just through the Q&A function, where you post your comment or question there, and I will request my colleagues Manyewu and Laura and of course Alberto to check the Q&A, and where they can respond, that will be useful. But if you take the floor, please just see if you can mention your name and the country. Now, the two questions that we would like, you may contribute more, but the two questions that we would like to get some feedback from you is that, one, based on what you've heard from particularly Laura and Alberto, but of course supported by Manyewu, do they respond to the need in your country? And if so, that's fine. But if not, what else is missing that you think will be important to be included when considering the overall picture of the capacity needs for Africa? So with that, I want to open the floor to colleagues that would like to contribute.
George, I'm seeing a question in the Q&A box. Someone
Okay,
has asked,
good.
they've asked, what are the recommendations for provision of these capacity needs and how do we go about getting this support? I don't know if I'm best placed to answer that. I did type an answer into the Q&A box to another question on how countries can be assisted to develop their agricultural MRVs and M&Es. But maybe Dr. Manyewu can address this one about the provision of these capacity needs and how to go about getting this support. Or even you, George, would you be?
So let's get Dr. Manyewu.
Yes, George.
As our big brother, how do we access these capacity needs and provision?
Yes, thanks, George. And I'm sure from this exercise, you know, participants may already realize that we have an ongoing exercise where we are actually developing training materials. As mentioned earlier by Laura, we have had a series of training workshops targeting these issues. Some of them, they've been planned for earlier this year, but because of our current situation, we've not been able to do those face-to-face trainings. But the current exercise, the intention is actually to build a war chest of training materials that we can use going forward in terms of supporting member states in the identified areas. So during this time, the best we can do is to build, to build the resources that we require that are targeted to respond to, those areas of need. And hopefully in better times, we can be able to use these resources, for targeted training and support to our member states going forward. So yeah, for now, all we can do is to gather that information and to prepare the materials that could support that capacity building in future. And hopefully as things improve, we should be in a position to better directly support our member states and other stakeholders, with addressing the challenges that would have been identified. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks. Just to reemphasize that, as Laura and Dr. Manyewu have indicated, initially there were two trainings that were held, one in Nairobi, another one in Dakar, and there was one planned for Southern Africa. It didn't take off. But also there were lessons learned from the feedback we received, that was received from those meetings, which now has necessitated to relook at the whole training package and see how further it can be further be enhanced, and with a view, and also to look at different approaches to which the training can be done. So I think what would be important for now would be that one, if we can solidify what are the key capacity needs that you think are necessary, then they will be informing the training materials, and thereafter, under the leadership of the AUDA-NEPAD, we should be able to find a way as to how best to support the countries. We are aware that the countries have challenges, and more importantly on the agriculture sector, because agriculture, as has been cited by Dr. Manyewu, is in all our NDCs, and therefore, if we don't plan for it well, then it means that we cannot optimize what we expect to get out of it, and that would not be beneficial to our countries. So it's important that we do it well, so that we can maximize what we can get out of the NDC process. The other one I can see is Marta from Hungary. It disappeared. Laura,
Sorry.
did you get it?
I typed in an answer, and I think that's why it made it disappear. So
okay.
I think it'd be great if we could actually pose that question to some of our people on the call. I see someone on the call who represents I think, Southern African farmers. I can't remember exactly the name of the organization, but we have some farmer representatives. And I'd love it if some of those could respond to this question. So the question is, do farmers understand exactly what climate change is? Do they feel the effects of it by themselves? How can you motivate them to change? What is their feeling to use new technology for decreasing the negative effects, for example, precision techniques? So, you know, I'm, I don't know if I'm best placed to answer that. So I would like to open it up. I see Majola on the call, and I don't want to put him in the hot seat, but if he would like to answer, that would be great. Or if anyone else would like to speak to this, please raise your hand and we can, oh, excellent. I see some hands coming up. Let me find who.
No, we have very many colleagues from ministries of agriculture who are practitioners. They should be able. So, and unfortunately, if you don't volunteer, I'll volunteer you. But I think Laura has already volunteered Majola. So Majola, as a farmers organization, do farmers understand this? What has been raised?
Good afternoon. Thank you, George. Thank you, Laura. Am I audible enough?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. I think taking it back to the first
introduce yourself, please.
Oh, my name is Majola Mabuza. I work for Southern African Confederation of Agricultural Unions, in short, SACAU. So in response to the question, I can just make reference to the first presentation that came from Manyewu, where I could see ourselves being part of what he brought up, that from the current NDC, from what was submitted initially, there wasn't that much of consultations. And from what we gathered from our members here in Southern Africa, we are represented in 12 countries in the region so far. None of our members were consulted in the development, even though it was a rush process. And we are looking to participating or helping our farmers to build that capacity so that they can participate meaningfully in this time around. And from where I see it, I felt even the study that was conducted by CCAFS, it was more of a study that was at a national level. And I wouldn't know who the respondents were, whether they included farmers' representatives or the private sector, or it was strictly the government representatives. Because if it did include the farmers' representatives at national level, I'm sure you would have gotten something to give an indication of where they currently stand in responding to this particular question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Majola. Can we get colleagues from Ministries of Agriculture who are on the call, maybe to just indicate to what extent, for example, the agriculture component of the NDC, they involve farmers? I know I have Morton, I have Gertrude, I have Veronica.
We have Khalid with his hand up.
Well, Khalid, go ahead, Khalid.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. This is Khalid Temsamani from Morocco. I just wanted to give a short témoignage of Morocco's experience in terms, especially of access to climate funding. So I would like to say that the AUDA, the Agricultural Development Agency of Morocco, that is an entity already accredited by the GCF, is currently underway in order to develop a gap assessment and a subsequent action plan in order to upgrade its funding status to projects over 50 million. and also to improve the monitoring and evaluation capacity system and develop a wider policy on gender to be implemented in its future projects. That's number one. Number two, we have two examples of one, a Moroccan National Development Bank that is being in the process to be accredited by the GCF. In fact, it was on the process in 2017, but now it is accredited at the time we are speaking now. And the second is a private case, a private bank case, like it has been explained earlier, as being one of the weakest leaks in the climate finance arena. It is the name of the bank is Attijari Wafa Bank. It was officially accredited at the 22nd meeting of the board of directors of the GCF in 2019. So this commercial bank will be able to support its public and private clients in their sustainable development projects, especially on the African continent. And this will be done through co-financing or investment guarantees, which can exceed these. So Attijari Wafa Bank is, we can say, the first accredited commercial bank in Africa until now. So those are a few examples that shows that how we can help private entities and semi-private entities to get access to accreditation by the GCF in order to support the people, to support the projects in Africa, to help access better those projects and to be implemented on the ground, especially in the agri sector. Thank you, George and Laura.
Yeah, thanks, Khalid. There's a question about which agrees on the question of capacitating farmers and agricultural officers, but they say the researchers need to be capacitated. So because they operate in silos. Do we have scientists, experts on this? But while others are thinking, I want to request Professor Yanlu, because under the Malabo there were those agreed areas of framework that the AUC and the AUDA were to develop. And one of the areas is that result area number 6 or component 6, which relates to resilience. And I know that he was leading a process where they were developing some tools on how to measure resilience or reflect. Prof, if you are online, please, if you can share some lessons, because that will be important for the M&E and part.
Hello, is it possible that we can comment on the issue before?
Yeah, just raise your knee and you will.
Hello, can you hear me, George?
Yes, yes.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Ayal, currently advisor as climate change and agriculture as the African Union Commission, seconded by JZ. Well, to respond to the question raised by George, as we actually may all recall, the AUC and its member states actually adopted the Malabo Declaration in 2014 with 7 commitments, one of which is actually commitment 6 on building or enhancing agricultural resilience and livelihoods. And also commitment 7, which is on reporting every 2 years on the progress made on the commitments. Accordingly, we have started supporting AU member states in building capacity on how to monitor and measure and report on resilience capacity building. Basically, for this purpose, we adopted the so-called RIMA, Resilience Index Measurement and Analysis, developed by FAO and we conducted a number of capacity building for regional experts, and then also for country representatives. At least 3 trainings for regional as well as for country representatives, where we have actually introduced the so-called RIMA, Resilience Index Measurement and Analysis. But of course, we're expecting some countries to adopt RIMA in reporting the second biennial review, but only few actually attempted to do that. Still, that shows that there is a need to continue to build capacity. And we expect actually more countries to use RIMA to report on resilience capacity building. And also in that commitment, we have basically 3 components. One is resilience of production systems, which is directly linked to climate smart agriculture, sustainable land use, and so on. Still there we have a deficiency, a gap in measuring. What we are actually trying to measure in RIMA is resilient livelihoods, where we actually considered food security and the production systems, the food systems as resilient. Therefore, there is still a gap where we have to focus on considering the production system, which includes soil and water conservation, maintenance of soil nutrients and soil health, and so on. Therefore, I think, need still to work very hard to actually bring about on measurement and analysis of resilience in this aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yanlu. Any other colleague who wants to comment on the presentation as made by the 3 colleagues, please feel free. And particularly if you could confirm whether you have something to add as part of the capacity needs that needs to be taken note of.
Hello, Gertrude from Malawi. Can I go on?
Yes, please, Gertrude.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Gertrude Kambaua. I work with the Ministry of Agriculture. First of all, let me thank you for organizing this webinar meeting so that we can also see how we are faring on the continent. But I think probably let me start with the question that was raised, and I think Majola started responding to that one. I just want to share that the farmers know, they have felt the impacts of climate change, and they have also proposed what probably we can do to support them from the technical side, from the ministry, for example. But in some cases, it is the financing that is the problem, because we don't have the money that is there to support them to the extent that would be help them to build the resilience that they need. So yes, the farmers know, but also they are using their own indigenous knowledge to adapt. So we are just working together with the resources that we have to support them. But probably to answer the questions that Laura has put on the screen, yes, the needs that have been identified, they respond to our country's situation. But I was thinking for what probably is missing. And in my opinion, I think it's something that we can deal with locally by contacting the other institutions that we're supposed to work with. But I thought it could also add value if, for example, in our country, the NDCs, they sit in the Secretariat, which is the Environmental Affairs Department. But also when you talk about national planning and budgeting, that's Ministry of Finance. I don't know how that can be done, but of course at country level, we're already doing it. But I think on this kind of platform, if they're also brought in, so that we can also hear from them or learn from the others how they're doing it. But I just thought to share, but I think it's something that we can also manage from the local coordination structures that we already have. But probably going forward on the engagement of private sector is an area that we have also noted, and we are working on it. And we are privileged that I think under the AU, we have what we're calling the CAP-F. I've forgotten the full name, but I know it's CAP-F, it's a framework of engaging the private sector. We are still learning how we can use that tool to help us in these processes, but we have seen that there's willingness in the local private sector to support the agriculture sector. And I'm sure they can also be willing to support the interventions that we can propose in the NDCs. And let me also mention that in developing the NDCs, the first ones, just like Manyewu pointed out, there was little engagement, even from ourselves in the ag sector, who were supposed to be on that team. As they are revising, I really am not sure at what pace, stage we are at, but we are hoping that we have tried to link up with the Secretariat, but we're having problems. But we think at some point we'll have a breakthrough so that we have a clear outline and even a framework in the NDCs of how we can promote agriculture under the changing climate, but also to build the resilience that we so much need for our farmers. So I thought I should just contribute on those two issues. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Gertrude. I think very useful input, especially the link, the coordination, in the sector, cross-sectoral coordination, I think is important, because in most of our countries, the coordination of climate change matters lies with the ministries of environment or climate change, whichever is applicable. And increasingly finance is coming in on the climate finance, and then therefore as an agriculture ministry, you will need to engage with this. So how do we engage? I think that's important. Yeah, but I think I'm getting worried that the ministry hasn't, agriculture, you haven't gotten brought on board on the agriculture component of the NDC in Malawi. I think that's going to be important. And Majola, that is something that you need to work with Gertrude so that we see how we can get the Environment Affairs Department to help us. Any other colleague who wants to make contribution?
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Standing on all protocols, and thank you very much for making me be part of this. I really appreciate the depth of discussions that have been made here, and I think we have great hope for Africa entirely in terms of resilience in agriculture. I was just going to say something a little general by looking at one of the gaps.
Tabi, you need to introduce yourself.
Sorry, please. I'm so sorry, please. My name is Tabi Joda. I am from Cameroon, at the same time from Nigeria. And I work mostly on climate adaptation and resilience, especially in the agroforestry value chains. And I was just going to identify that one of the gaps that exist that we could look at how to enhance is the gaps that exist in terms of when looking at agricultural resilience, we look only at agriculture in terms of just a sector of agriculture. We are not looking at agriculture in terms of the potentials in the value chains at all levels, starting from the food production to food processing and the market systems that involves the end miles of this food, which can help very greatly in strengthening resilience, especially in terms of the income streams that can support local farmers to have some level of independence in terms of dependence on funds or funding, external funding. That's just what I wanted to add.
No, very useful, Tabi. Because and I think that's why initially the scope was on agriculture, and as presented by Laura, it was expanded to food systems, and then therefore we have to look at the whole value chain in that respect. So thanks for that reminder. Any other colleague? So I would like to hear colleagues on the experience on the access of climate finance in their countries, and probably whether their efforts to enhance that, and if so, what will be the key things that need to be done. Anybody who wants to take that floor on climate finance and more so private sector?
Well, maybe I can start from Malawi.
Okay, go ahead,
Just to
Gertrude.
share where we are at. Yeah.
Okay.
We had started a process to come up with a concept which we thought we are going to share with the GCF, but we had some glitches, as you've already pointed out. The sourcing of an accredited entity was an issue, but now we have FAO that is going to support us. And currently we're looking at how we are going to do that process, but they'll be able to support us. So we think that process will be able to finalize it, something that we started a while ago. And we should be able to see it go through the whole process, and then we get the funding to implement this project. But currently we have had an opportunity that as the ministry is going to be participating in another project that has gotten finance from the Adaptation Fund. Because we are several of us in the department, so colleagues are working on that, but I'm aware that we'll be implementing a program that has been supported by the Adaptation Fund. Yeah, but also supporting other projects that have already been financed through the GCF. And we are part of the implementing teams on the ground. So probably that's a start. Thank you.
No, very useful, and I'm happy that that FAO is now picking up the work that was done by under AUDA and GIZ CADAP support program. Any other colleague who wants to?
Climate finance.
Yes.
Hello. So, yeah.
Yes.
So I was just trying to spot. I went through most of the CADAP final documents, so the processes that have been accumulated across the continent in recent times. So I thought, in terms of climate finance and the relationship to private sector, we should be very, very strong at developing the entrepreneurial skills or capacity, which helps, especially at the local communities level, in enhancing capacity to identify wealth potentials or wealth streams potentials, which can help in strengthening new spring up of private startups that could also be part of the opportunities for climate finance, from looking at indigenous opportunities for climate finance, which will eventually create large streams of private sectors, which is what I think constitutes a very good opportunity. The more private sectors we have with the understanding and good knowledge in identifying those existing potentials, especially in the food systems at local levels especially, will help in reducing some of the gaps that are existing. Then again, in terms of climate finance, for governments, there's this existing gaps that most of the people working on the climate finance capacity development projects, or even the climate finance projects development, don't seem to really have a strong background in climate. So there's a need that these people with this weak background should have first, of course, or some training, or depend on those who have this background to be able to develop these materials, which can really help in identifying the real challenges and how these challenges can be linked to the solutions. That will help.
Very useful.
Yes, thank you.
No, very useful, Tabi. Any other colleague? So the other one which I wanted to find out, particularly colleagues from ministries of agriculture, is that currently many countries are involved in updating the NDCs. But also, if you recall, the Paris Agreement requires that countries formulate the long-term strategies so that the NDC becomes the implementation tool. is there any progress in your countries? What's the progress in your countries, especially from the agriculture sector, to ensure that there is an alignment between the long-term strategy and the NDC, updating of the NDC? I'm waiting.
While you're waiting, George, maybe I
Yes.
can I can just answer this. There's a question.
Yeah.
That I may just attempt to answer here while you're waiting for responses on your question. It's a question from a colleague in Zimbabwe. They say the farmers are aware of the effects of climate change, e.g. the late onset of rains, high frequency of droughts, etc. What farmers lack is the capacity to adapt. Implementation of NDCs also requires some level of national commitment. That the AU is there a way of compelling governments to advance their NDCs. I can just answer that quickly, just to say we don't have a mechanism for compelling governments, as such, because these are autonomous, governments. So for us, our role is to support, to provide the support that governments require, whether it's technical, if possible, also even financially, in actually delivering their own commitments on NDCs and other priorities that they will have set. So our modus operandi is not through compelling governments, it's through advising and supporting, and complementing what they are already doing.
Thanks, Manyewu. But I just want also to add by saying that if you look at the decision of the African Ministers of Environment in November last year in Durban, they stress and encourage countries to do the planning and the submission of the NDCs and NAPs. So within and as you are aware, the AMSEN meetings resolutions and decisions are finally adopted, included into the AU summit, which confirms those by the heads of state. So yes, there's no compelling mechanism, but the among themselves, the countries agree on a structure that encourages each one of them to be able to comply with those requirements. Okay, any other colleague that would like to raise something? So if that is the case, then the key point here will be, is it possible to hear from colleagues how best they think this training can be done? Bear in mind that, of course, there are difficulties now with COVID and the rest. So if we can get some ideas on the best way to build capacity on implementation of NDCs, that would be useful. So this is an open-ended where we're simply looking out for ideas as to now that we have identified there is a need, then it means that we have to push the envelope to make sure that that need is addressed through the training. and we'll be happy to hear from experiences elsewhere or ideas on what colleagues who are participating to this need, what they think and how they think the training could be done. Anybody who needs the floor? Evans Kitui, are you there? Is Evans there? Or he disappeared? Alex,
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, I think, thank you once again. My name is Tabi Joda from Cameroon and Nigeria. For those who are just joining, and I still stand on existing protocols. I just spot on the last pre-COP capacity meeting and looking at that arrangement that happened and how the outcome was so almost perfect. I think that kind of format can still be approached either at the continental level or even kind of trickle down to national or regional level, as the case may be. But I saw in that meeting a very creative and innovative way of quickly assimilating ideas, you know, faster and efficiently.
Are you able to explain a little about what you experienced?
Yes, with the amount of knowledge that was shared just within a very short period of 2 days, in terms of the approach, the workshop nature, the first general introduction, which we're putting perspectives together, and then they split out into the gender and agriculture, and then you saw that within a very short period of time, ideas within the group division at the agriculture and group division at the gender were able to come up with very robust documents that had a whole lot of great material that went into the discussions at the SBs. So I am kind of suggesting if that kind of approach could be used as well, with the also with the participation of the kind of resources that we had, people that were present, who were very, very willing and experienced enough to share ideas, and the kind of training that can quickly be translated into action.
No, thank you, Tabi, and thanks. Yeah, we always do our best, but of course we can always do better. Any other colleague?
Sure.
Khalid, from a country perspective, what would you think would be the best way to build capacity? Also, bear in mind this is Africa-wide challenge.
No, just while you're waiting on that one, can I just
please go ahead.
Just try and answer a question that has been posed by one of the participants?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a question from Manette. She says, what can we learn from the current COVID-19 fundraising efforts? What is the role of the African Union in funding climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts in Africa? I think this is a very interesting question, and I agree that there are some lessons, you know, that can be learned from some of the trends that we saw with respect to fundraising, you know, for the COVID-19 response. It was very, you know, in my view, it was very clear that the private sector or other non-traditional sort of sources of financing can really make a big difference. In other parts of the continent, the contributions that came from the private sector were quite staggering. And, in my view, it's something that we can learn from, and something that we can plan for going forward, and say, how do we, build on these efforts and not wait for disasters? And how do we almost preempt some of these disasters with the support of the same private sector and other players, which we probably don't always go to, in our day-to-day fundraising efforts. So for me, it was the more, the non-traditional sources of financing that were eye-catching, to me, in terms of their significance in such a short period of time. So in terms of the role of African Union in terms of financing climate adaptation and mitigation, of course, we are part of efforts with our partners to support, our member states in adaptation and mitigation efforts. But I think there are many more opportunities that we can pursue to build, the sort of resource base that is required going forward. And yes, I agree that, the COVID experience could be a learning platform for us. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Manyewu. Any colleague?
Hello, George. Gertrude here.
Yes, Gertrude.
Sorry, I stepped out a bit, but I just found you asking how we're going to implement the capacity building program.
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah. Yes. Any ideas?
Well, in the context of COVID, or just a
No,
general
no.
approach? But I
As a general approach and looking at the future.
I see. I think at country level, if we get the support to have the partner stakeholders brought together so that we are in the same room and we get this kind of training. But of course, I also know that these platforms, the webinars, but I know participation in webinars may not be easy for, I think, the country, but I know people do take part. But I think bringing the stakeholders together, just like we did with the other trainings that we've participated in as we're developing the concept notes, I thought that would also be one of the ways that we can be effective, I think, because then we get like input that is required from all the stakeholders, and maybe then the next text can be agreed from those sessions. Thank you.
Very useful. Any other colleague? Catherine?
Hello.
Yes, Catherine.
Okay, yeah. I know Laura has has been asking me on the chat to share some of the insights that emerged during the webinar that we had with on youth and in agribusiness and how they are coping in the context of a changing climate and also with the pandemic. And one of the young people pointed out that they have developed some online training manuals on poultry. So, and for them, these manuals are posted online and they are freely available and anyone can access. And then they organize sessions using Facebook and other social media platforms where they can conduct the trainings. So I don't know if that is a model that we would want to do our capacity building, at country level, given the current challenges, but I know there could also be cost implications because of developing the manuals. Is it something that we want to make free? But like Gertrude said, perhaps now we then need to explore avenues such as Zoom and see if people would be willing to still pay in order to attend these trainings. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine. Is that Tabi?
George?
Yes.
This is Khalid.
Yes, Khalid. Please, go ahead.
just a quick comment about the capacity building issue. Just we need to remind, remind ourselves that in the rural areas of our respective countries, the level of literacy is very low. So in terms of building capacity of the rural farmers, women's, youth, etc., if we rely on we should develop more audiovisual person that are on the ground experiencing difficulties, especially during this period of time where the level of poverty. To reach out to those people, let us go toward more audiovisual platform tools to reach out to them in order to raise their capacity and send messages, concrete messages to those people for them to be more resilient to what's happening now. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's useful, and I think that's what. Oh, sorry.
Yes, George.
Yes.
Back to you, George.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think this is very useful because I think we are now kind of dividing.
Back to you, George.
Yes, we're trying to identify the levels of engagement. So the current training is at the technical people in the ministries and that kind of level. But what is also emerging is that implementation of NDC will require the people who are directly involved, which is the lower level farmers, the youth, and all those that are coming up. And therefore, we need to think through as to how to deal with that. I think that's a very useful input. Any other colleague? We have 10 minutes, let's say 5 minutes, so that we have the other 5 just to wrap up. Any colleagues who would like to contribute before I go back to our 3 presenters, if they have any remarks to make based on the input they have put.
Hi, George.
Yes, Annette, how are you?
Yes, it's Annette. Fine, and you? Yeah, thanks for organizing this session. Yes, I just wanted to touch a bit on how capacity development can be done. And I was wondering whether we could add a component of mentorship to capacity development, because I understand you've already done the training into countries. So can those who have been trained mentor colleagues in other countries? Probably people can be paired up in the other countries, and then they mentor and coach each other. And now where those who have been trained can also practice the skills that they acquired from the previous trainings, and it can be an ongoing process.
Yeah, I think that's very useful. I think it's one that we AGNES we have adopted for the leadership program, and we think that should be. I mean, it's something that we think it's useful. Any other colleague?
Yeah, George.
Yes, Evans, you are hiding.
No, I had actually stepped out for 2 minutes to pick a cup of coffee.
Okay, so what do you think, how best can this training be done, notwithstanding COVID, even in the future? What would be the best model if any?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've been advocating for is a consideration of how the future of agriculture and food systems will look like. And other than climate considerations, there other things, that needs to be considered. Application of things like ICTs, consideration of the role of gender, things like how business models are really changing. And in view of that, the role of the private sector, for example, is, we are seeing more of it going towards contract farming, even for crops that were previously not so much attractive. And the private sector that is involved in those kinds of production are actually doing it. They are spending their own resources on ensuring that they are, building capacity of persons who are carrying out the extension services, having realized that the ministry's capacities to sustain extension services are dwindling. They are, if not dying off, they are quite minimal. So the role of private sector, and there is need for incentives on that, particularly from the policy side. And then the other thing is, of course, looking at the curriculum for the institutions that are responsible for building capacity of the youth, so that when they go out in the sector, in the industry, they are well versed with abilities, like, for example, helping a farmer to spot and co-develop opportunities for resilience building, And then, of course, even with the in-service programs, with the few officers that are still out there in the field, there is need for them to be regularly updated with the new knowledge, the new skills that are coming on board that are necessary for the kinds of development that are happening in the agricultural sector. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I see Edna.
Yes, good afternoon. I just wanted
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm fine. Introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Edna Cramer. I work with AUDA-NEPAD on the program called the Gender, Climate Change and Agriculture Support Program. So I just wanted to point out one experience that we have had in the implementation of this program, especially where capacity building is concerned. We have had some kind of implementation where we have had the NGOs implementing the projects, but what I just wanted to point out is the approach of trainers of trainers. I would think that this would also be an important approach that can be used in capacity building, because when you train like several, then they can go about to replicate or train other people, and in so doing, you end up training more people than just a few that were trained before. So I would also propose that this should be considered so that many people can be capacitated. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Edna. Yeah, so colleagues, I think we've had a round of colleagues' contribution. So I would want to give 1 minute to each of our colleagues who made the presentation, so that they can share briefly their final thoughts. Start with Manyewu.
Thank you, George. I think there's been a good discussion in terms of, what needs to happen. And I think we are clear that particularly the NDCs, if we get things right in the NDCs as the overarching framework for climate action for African countries, those successes will trickle down to the strength of the programs and the planning that we will do at the country level. So I really hope that we can sustain the momentum in terms of, strengthening the needs, the areas that have been identified.
private sector engagement, really, you know, getting a hold of the issue of financing, because it's a key issue that we cannot afford to fail on. Somehow we have to find solutions, and also to take charge and realize that financing is not just for us to expect others to, you know, to finance from somewhere else. You know, nationally, the governments, the private players, and the citizens themselves, there's a lot more that can happen nationally, you know, that can contribute to designing programs that have got business orientation, that have got sustainability inbuilt in them, and with the greater chances of success. So I think we need to take charge of the finance element and really grab the bull by the horns, so to speak. And if we can do that, I think we will have a lot of success across the continent. Thank you very much.
Okay, quickly, Mayor, 30 seconds, Laura.
Thanks so much, George, and thank you everybody for your participation. I think the inputs are really useful. It'll help us as we revise the materials, and so those materials will be made available online through the AUDA knowledge portal. So once they're finished, they'll be put online and freely accessible. And then at the same time, GIZ, AGNES, AUDA, and CCAFS are thinking through the way to revise the approach as well. So your inputs today are really helpful in that process. So thank you all very much for that. Thank you.
Alberto, 30 seconds.
Thank you, George. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for facilitating, and then for everyone that joined today and for those that organized. It's been a very useful process for us, and the discussion today was really engaging and very interesting to see where countries are and then what their potential needs are and how we can actually try to address those by engaging on the subsequent work that comes forward. With regards to the climate finance, a lot of really interesting comments. Very much second those comments on private sector, and yeah, we'll see how countries on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, colleagues, on my part, I want to thank you, all of you, colleagues. I know you are all very busy doing many things, and for you to create time to, one, to respond to the survey that was sent out, and two, to create time to join this webinar. We are very, very grateful. And on behalf of the AUDA-NEPAD, SV Naren, of course, GIZ, CCAFS, and AGNES, we want to thank you most sincerely and wishing you well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Dr. George, thank you so much. Well done.
Thank you.
Well
See
done.
you next time. Bye-bye.
See you next time. See you soon. Stay safe.